Right. All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Majors and Quinn stream. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Matthew. I am a bookseller as well as an events operator here at the store. And just in case if y'all don't know, Majors and Quinn is an independent bookseller in the Uptown Minneapolis area. And I just want to take a quick second to thank everybody for joining us this evening. I think I speak for everybody that works here and part of our community. Just a big thank you for allowing us to do what we do. We really can't do what we do here in Uptown without your support and just being part of our community, showing up to these events, purchasing books from us, selling your books to us, whatever you do with us. Just a big thank you from the bottom of our hearts for that. And if this is your first time, a very special welcome to you. If not, welcome back. We appreciate any and all continued support, and thank you for that. So this evening, I am very pleased to welcome the authors of One True Sentence, Mark Cirino, as well as Michael Van Cannon, in conversation with Ross Tangedal and Kawai Strong Washburn. We'll get to bios in a second. But if you are interested in purchasing a copy of the book, I will be posting a comment in the comments section with a link to our website where you can purchase the book at majorsandquinn.com. And then speaking of the comments section, please talk to us. We are taking questions all throughout the event. I'll be taking note of them, and then the authors will be discussing them when the time is right for that as they go along. So if you have anything, please send that our way. Let us know where you're viewing from. And yeah, please be part of this. We want you to take part in what's happening here. So without further ado, a little bit about our speakers this evening. Mark Cirino is the co-editor of One True Sentence and the host of One True Podcast. He is the author and editor of 7 previous books about Ernest Hemingway and serves as the general editor for Kent State University Press's Reading Hemingway series. He served as a consultant on the film adaptation of Hemingway's Across the River and Into the Trees. Cirino teaches American literature at the University of Evansville. Michael Van Cannon is the producer of One True Podcast. He serves as an advisory editor on the multi-volume Hemingway Letters project and is co-editor of the final volume of the Letters of Ernest Hemingway, 1957 through 1961. Van Cannon teaches at Florida Gulf Coast University. Ross K. Tangedal is a assistant professor of English and director of the Cornerstone Press at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. He is the author of The Preface, American Authorship in the 20th Century, and co-editor of Editing the Harlem Renaissance. He is a contributing editor for the NEH-funded Hemingway Letters Project, where he is associate editor of Volume 6 of Letters, the Letters of Ernest Hemingway, 1934 through 1936. And finally, last but not least, Kawai Strong Washburn was born and raised on the Hamakua coast of the Big Island of Hawaii. His first novel, Sharks in the Time of Saviors, won the 2021 PEN Hemingway Award and the 2021 Minnesota Book Award. It was also longlisted for the 2020 Center for Fiction First Novel Prize and was a finalist for the 2021 PEN Gene Stein Book Award. President Barack Obama chose it as his favorite novel of 2020, and it was selected as a notable or best book of the year by over a dozen publications, including the New York Times and Boston Globe. So without further ado, let me get out of the way so we can properly start tonight's event. Everyone welcome in our authors and speakers.
Thank you very much, Matthew. We really appreciate it. Hi, everybody. I'm Mark Cirino. Before we start, I just want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. It's really a pleasure. I also want to thank Majors and Quinn for hosting this. As Matthew was saying, amazing that an independent bookstore would be so supportive of us. And this is probably a moment where we should be really supportive of independent bookstores. So anything you can do to support Majors and Quinn and independent bookstores like that, I think that would be a great cause. Well, it's really an honor for Michael and me as the creators of One True Podcast and the editors of One True Sentence to be here with a stellar Hemingway scholar like Ross Tangedal and a wonderful fiction writer like Kawai, Strong Washburn. So perhaps this is how our discussion will work. Maybe if Michael and I could start just for a few minutes to talk about how the book came about, and then we can talk a little bit more in more substance about Ross and Kawai's respective contributions to the book. Both of them are incredible chapters. Michael, maybe I can start just to say that Michael and I independently had the idea for a podcast about Hemingway. I mean, there's a podcast about just about any topic, but there wasn't one about Hemingway. So we had a chat. We thought that would be a good idea. And for whatever reason, after rejecting some pretty corny ideas, we got the name One True Podcast in mind. And when we called it One True Podcast, it was an allusion to a sentence that to something that Hemingway said, which was he remembers telling himself as a young writer in Paris, all you have to do is write one true sentence, write the truest sentence that you know. So finally, I would write one true sentence and go on from there. And so we called it One True Podcast. It had that kind of arrogance and brashness that we thought would be on brand. So we went with it. And so as part of a component of our podcast, we had a feature where we would ask our guests their one true sentence from all of Hemingway's work, that they would choose one sentence out of the thousands and thousands of Hemingway's work that what is it, the sentence that is most meaningful or poignant or profound or controversial or Hemingway-esque, or just the sentence that they were most eager to talk about. And I think to Michael and my great surprise, rather than hang up on us or make fun of us, they went along with it. So guests like Elizabeth Stroud and Russell Banks and A. Scott Berg and Kawai and Ross, they were like, all right, we'll play. We think it's a little silly, but we'll play anyway. And so we do a deep dive on a sentence, and that's been a real substance of our podcast.
It is such a wicked, silly question to ask. And I know, Mark, you have a sentence that you've held on to for a while. It took me such a long time. And when we ask guests, I think they're going to have to look through their books, reread numerous stories, but it seems like many of them have sentences right at their fingertips. And so we're going to dig into some of those today. But, in part because of the one true sentence concept, we got a call from Josh Bodwell at Godine Press, and that led to the book that we're talking about tonight, One True Sentence, Writers and Readers on Hemingway's Art. It's filled with a lineup of amazing contributors, and we're talking about writers and scholars and political figures and other kinds of cultural luminaries. And we have two wonderful contributors here tonight, Kawai Strong Washburn and Ross Tangedal, to talk about their sentences. So, we might start where we start every single interview from the book, and that is with that question: what is your one true sentence? And then the harder question, and why? Right. So maybe we can move there.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Kawai, why don't you start us off? Of what did you pick? Which one did you pick, and why did it stick out for you?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'll just echo all the great things people have already said, not only about the book and the project itself, but the Majors and Quinn bookstore as well. And I'm not sure if it's exactly because of the Penn Hemingway Award that this came about, but I always also like to take a moment to thank the Penn Foundation and the Hemingway Foundation together for having that award. I know for me, it meant a world of difference receiving that award. I think the book and myself received a lot of attention that might have not been the case because my book came out right during the pandemic. Like March 2020 was the publication date of the book. So there were no events that were live. Everything was canceled. Virtual events hadn't really been sorted out yet. And so early on, I think my book really struggled to find any sort of audience. And so I really appreciate the award and everything it gave me. It's also nice going to the UCross Foundation and having the opportunity to write for 3 weeks. I got to write for 2 weeks, actually. I can only say for 2 weeks, but all I did was write. I wrote, and there was great food and this lovely, like, idyllic place out in the middle of Wyoming that I got to write. And I got well over 100 pages done of the next novel I was working on. So that time was incredibly valuable as well. So I just wanted to thank the Hemingway Foundation for that as well. And so for me, in terms of what I chose as the one true sentence, it was from a short story called A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. I could go into more detail about why, particularly that short story and all of that, but just to read the sentence itself, it was, some lived in it and never felt it, but he knew it all was nada y pues nada, y nada y pues nada. And that's a moment in the story in which the older of the two waiters that are in this short story, he'd left for the night after they've kind of ruminated on the state of life of a particular individual, an old man who's gone deaf. That's at like the cafe that these two waiters are working at. And it's time to close down, and one of them, the younger one and the older one, have different opinions on who this old man is and what he represents in that evening. And after they close down the cafe and they all go home, the older waiter he stops at I don't know what it would be called. This is a long time ago. It was like just sort of an outdoor cart, almost like a liquor cart. I don't know exactly what these things were. They existed a long time ago. And he stopped there and got a drink. And while he was there and he asked the barman for a drink, he thinks of that sentence. And so that was what I selected. I'll stop there. I feel like I talked for a really long time.
No, you didn't. Kawai, the thing that, and Ross, maybe we can bring you in on this. The thing that Michael and I noticed about A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. So as Kawai mentioned, it's like a 3 or 4 page short story. Elizabeth Strout picked Clean, Well-Lighted Place, a sentence from A Clean, you did. And so did Billy Collins, who is not in this book, but hopefully if there's ever a sequel, he'll definitely be in that one. What is it about this particular story that seems like, is there something about it that Hemingway reached some sort of height with this story, even though it seems so quirky and so small? Ross, what do you think about that particular story among all of Hemingway's works?
Well, I always read Clean, Well-Lighted Place as a story not about, he starts by, it's about this old man drinking at the cafe or spending time at the cafe. And so we're sucked into this character's life based on the conversation between the waiters. But especially when you're teaching it, when you illuminate that the story is probably really about the older waiter, and everything that's being concerned about has nothing to do really with the old man and the cup and the beautiful sentence, first sentence about how the light shines through the leaves and casts a shadow on the man drinking under the eave there. It's about the older waiter. And so you recast the whole story as sort of a bit of biography about that character. And Hemingway's really good at that. And really the best writers is you go in thinking that the story is about a specific character because that's the frame you get. But then you have to keep going to understand that it's really about someone else entirely. And it breaks your heart that way because now your heart's broken for the waiter when you didn't expect that to be happening.
Yeah. And I mean, please,
no,
Michael, go ahead.
I was gonna say. I mean, we can. I was gonna connect this to the other story that we're going to be mentioning, which is Indian Camp. Hemingway does this so much, even though we know Nick Adams is the protagonist. Indian Camp is so focused on the father; it's focused on this birth, and yet we have Nick who's just kind of tucked away, and we know that he's going to be learning something, and he's going to be the focus of that story. Though so much of the action is focused elsewhere, it seems like Hemingway will do that time and again. That someone who is the observer of what is the center of the action, right, is someone who then, especially towards the end, really becomes the focus.
Yeah. Right. Kawai, when you read your sentence, the idea that continues to be repeated is nada. And I wonder if that means something about in Hemingway's work in general. is there a sort of emptiness or depression or negativity that you would think is a defining quality to his work, or at least to this particular story?
I would argue that it's certainly a defining characteristic of his work. Certainly for me as a reader, it's one of the, you know, the sadder emotions, sadness and a sense of loss, and maybe not quite regret, but disappointment suffuses a lot of the work. Like, I think at the end of a lot of his books, and they can be really brutal endings, right? Like, if you think of the end of A Farewell to Arms, or the end of The Sun Also Rises, and it's not quite cynical, because I think there's still heart there. There's still a desire to like love the world and to have some level of passion for life. But there's a certain amount of disappointment and sadness that I think is there in a lot of his work. And I think one of the things for me that this particular story, A Clean, Well-Lighted Place, I think, first of all, I read it really early on as a literary reader, right? Having moved from reading the things I read when I was younger that were largely speculative fiction in genre, to suddenly reading literature, you know, big L literature when I was in college. And that was just as a side day. I didn't study literature in college. I studied computer science, but I had to take a literature class. And I remember that this book, I'm almost certain this story was in the anthology. And I don't even think I read it for class. I think I read it later. But I remember being like, it was the first time I think I had encountered something where they were covering like suicide, right? Like this older man, they're like, oh, he tried to kill himself, right? And so that is there, that deep sadness is there. And then this older waiter, we come to find out, has like insomnia and things like that. And so there's all these things that for me, it was the first time I think that I encountered some of those themes, right? And all of that happens, as Ross mentioned, it's such a short story and it's so compressed. And I think it's why a lot of people, it sticks out for a lot of people, this one. And I feel like that Hills Like White Elephants are two that it's like a perfect, I will forever be jealous of writers that can do that, where you can write something that's like 3 or 4 pages and it just, there's like, you couldn't take another word out of it if you wanted to, but the effect of it is just devastating, right? You read it, it's 3 or 4 pages and it does more in 3 or 4 pages than most writers do in 15, 20, 30, you know, for me, like 300 pages, right, is done here in like 3. So I think the economy of the language, yet the scope of the emotional, you know, the scope of like human existence that's there. And I think having the framing of a young waiter and an old waiter, and you think, and then this man that's at the cafe, and you think it's about this man, but then all of a sudden it's both about this young waiter and this old waiter. And so you're looking at kind of the entire arc of a person's life as an adult, right? That's from young to old. And it's all right there. This is all like 3 pages. Like, I was so jealous. You know, it's fantastic. So.
In the chapter, Kawai mentions that somewhat self-deprecatingly, that he said, the reason I write novels is because I'd be so terrible at trying to write a 3 or 4 page short story. But I'm not sure that's true, but it is a great feat to be able to do this in such a short span of words. Maybe we can go to Ross's sentence, because there's one really key element that we can use to tie both of these together. Ross, why don't you hit us with your one true sentence and why?
Sure. So, as most, especially Hemingway scholars, we have lots of favorite sentences, and that's what makes this a very difficult task. But this one has always stood out, especially now as I teach Hemingway's fiction to undergraduates. This one always stands out, you know, regardless of the scenario. So my one true sentence is from Indian Camp. It all took a long time. So there's nothing very descriptive about that sentence. It is an impersonal pronoun. A long time, that's not a definite space. We don't know if that's 5 minutes, if that's 2 hours. It all encompassing what exactly? What is the all? And of course, in the story, and again, just like with Clean, Well-Lighted Place, Indian Camp is a 2 or 3 page short story, right? At this point in the story, Nick is holding the basin for his father as his father's performing a cesarean section on a Native American woman up in the Indian camp. And he is experiencing all of this. Well, I argue his eyes are closed. So he's holding the basin like this, but he can't plug his ears. So hearing what's going on is probably much, much worse than seeing what's going on. And as a 10 or 12-year-old, he has no way of describing, since the story is not a first-person narrative, but it's filtered through Nick's experience. So therefore, we are Nick as the story is unfolding. And because he doesn't have words like surgery or labor or pregnancy, he doesn't 10 and 12-year-olds don't understand what those words are. So all he can really do to understand this multi-sensory really terror that he's experiencing, which has been built up early in the story with various other sensory clues, is to say that the screaming, the smells, the everything about what he's experiencing, it all took a long time. So I then argue that the it is the darkness in Hemingway,
right.
At least in this contribution to your excellent book. It is darkness, which segues nicely to Clean Well Lighted Place, because that sort of darkness comes up in depression, suicide, thoughts of violence. And so darkness in Hemingway is a much more ethereal and abstract notion than just saying depression or suicide. It's this
Right.
darkness that can envelop things, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, I think that is a great point. And both sentences that Kawai and Ross picked have it and all in it. And so that probably, I mean, I think the larger point that makes is that we have to figure out if Hemingway is a writer who reveals things or a writer who withholds things, and where is the line, and when is it effective and when is it not effective. And I know that is a massive question, but Kawai, I wonder, as a fiction writer, how you draw that line about, I mean, perhaps we could talk a little bit, maybe a little bit later, about Hemingway's Iceberg Theory of where he implies more than he actually states. And he thought that was more powerful and better reading experience for the reader. But how do you negotiate that, Kawai?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge, and it's an important one, is to trust your readers, right? That's another way people talk about that. And it's like, the more you give the reader what they're going to kind of, if you give the reader's mind the active space, the space to make the jump, to make the inference, then it's going to be a much richer experience for the reader, right? People want to be engaged as readers. I know I want to be engaged as readers. And I think everybody is. That's why, books like mystery books, for instance, they sell very, very well. People that write mystery novels, like, people love mystery novels. And one of the reasons is because their brain is always engaged in trying to solve the puzzle. And there are little clues here and there. And they're like, oh, that person definitely did it. And then there's some reveal and they're like, that person didn't do it. Who did it instead? Right. And so that they're engaged the whole time in trying to solve this puzzle. And so I think when you're writing books that are much more concerned with the human experience than some external event, which is what you get more with genre literature. And again, I'm not disparaging genre literature. These are just different types of stories, right? Mm-hmm. And so when you have a story that's focused on kind of the internality of the characters, then having just enough there's got to be enough subtlety and just a little bit of some stuff there for the reader's mind to grasp onto and to think about. And you as a writer, and I think the hardest part is when as a writer, like, you have an idea of what the answer is often, right? Or sometimes you're like, I kind of have an idea about what this is about. But if I tell the reader that, or if I show them too strongly, then that magic is lost, the magic of the reader's mind being engaged. So it's a constant, and I think it's also fun as a writer to make room for ambiguity, to be like, I don't really know either. I'm going to put all the ingredients here. I'm going to put this scene together. And I don't even necessarily know entirely what it's about, but I know just enough. I have some guesses. And if I put a little bit about those guesses in there, then the readers are going to come to their own conclusions as well.
Is there a danger to that if you understate something and you leave the reader sort of floating around? So is it about a balance or finding that
it key? Is, and that's what's really challenging, right? When you say, like, trust the reader or whatever, it's to a certain extent you're like, all right, assume that if you give them just enough, then they're going to make that jump, and and the thing that's fun is if you do it just right, then a lot of people have different ideas about what the story is about, right? But that's very hard to do. It's very easy to overdo it. It's very easy to have it as a writer. You're like, this is what this is about, and I'm going to just go ahead and tell the reader, right? And I think a lot of writers will be guilty of doing it in dialogue. I can't tell you how many books I've read, and some of them are fantastic books, but there'll be some little sections where I'm like, oh, this is the writer's, like, opinion coming through here. Right. And so that's the challenge is having your own idea of what it is, but give it just enough of what's there to get the reader engaged, to see a little bit of symbolism here and there, to have a little bit of what's ever there to look at, but to not give them the full answer and to leave that open for ambiguity. Very, very challenging, very challenging. I think it's a lot easier to overdo it than underdo it. I think underdoing it, you kind of, even as a writer, will feel a little bit adrift or confused to be like, what exactly is going on here, right? And so I think it's a lot easier to overdo it than underdo it. But getting that balance is definitely challenging.
This is one of the most fascinating things that shows up in the book, is this debate here, right? How Hemingway can trust the reader to, on the one hand, figure out what's buried in the 7/8 below the surface of the water. On the other hand, there's the other trust, which is to trust the reader to participate in the actual reading process and to come to some kind of conclusion for themselves. And I don't know, for Kawai or for Ross, do you see Hemingway himself through the Iceberg Theory working in different ways? How do you read Hemingway and the Iceberg? Are you more of a reader who's looking for that thing that Hemingway is buried somewhere, or are you a reader who engages in the reading process alongside? Like, what does that trust look like for you as a reader of Hemingway?
Well, I guess I've only gotten more interested in Hemingway's craft the more I read him. I mean, I think that's the key. Is when I first read him as an undergraduate, I was just like every other undergraduate. Oh, what's this about? What are these stories about? There's nothing going on. There's really no plot. There's nothing to grab onto. Kawai's right. I love police procedurals. You know why? Because there's a routine. There's an order. Things happen at a certain time. I expect it. I get it. I feel good. I'm engaged. I'm with you. Hemingway, he draws us so far back away from that procedure. But at the same time, it's all about detail. And so he's not, when your undergraduates say, well, there's nothing going on here. Well, that's your key to dive in with them and start showing those details. And you can pick any Hemingway story for the most part, and you can do this sort of close reading. But look at Indian Camp. There's so many little details that pop up. The late Pete Hayes, who just passed away a few months ago, he has a great essay about how, do you notice in Indian Camp that the Indians, they turn the kerosene oil down on their kerosene lamps as they're walking down the logging road, because the moon shines through the trees and you can see your way down the path. Well, the only reason they're doing that is because they're preserving kerosene, because they're so poor, because of poverty and the way that the loggers had come through. And I mean, you just start layering and layering and layering and layering these really illuminating details. And then you ask students, well, did he intend for all of that to be in the story? Is that all an intention? And if not, you say, well, that's also what craft is about, is that it provides you with the opportunity, this canvas, to play with all of these different possibilities. And if you can play with those possibilities in 2 or 3 pages instead of in 300, there has to be something else attached to that. And some would call it genius, some would call it talent. But a lot of us call it art, and so that's what we have.
Right, and back to the word "it," where in Kawai's sentence, the word "it" is said 3 times, and I mean, it might mean something different all 3 times, or it might be the same thing all 3 times, and it might depend on who the reader is. And Hemingway must have been comfortable with allowing the reader to wrestle with that. I think that it's so. Clean, Well-Lighted Place is 1933, and that's sort of a middle story, and Ross's Indian Camp is an early story. But it's really shocking the kind of confidence that he had, allowing the reader to participate in creating the meaning. Ross, are 21st century students accepting of the iceberg theory, or is this something that frustrates them based on what you guys were saying about the sort of the reliance on order and instant information?
Almost to the almost to the person when we do reflections about the stories we read in class, whether it's in composition or, and I got to do a major authors class, a year ago on Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. I think to the person, their answer was, initially, when you read, especially Hemingway's short stories, there's a frustration with something else must be going on, but I'm not seeing it. And so when I get to Tangedal's class, we're going to figure it out. We're going to find out together what's going on. And then we do, which is great. It never ceases to be fun, at least for me. But when they start noticing trends, like again, any great artist, there's trends and you can track it across specific pieces. The it comes up, you're right, it's all over the place. It's in the older fiction, it's in the younger fiction. It all took a long time. It isn't fun anymore. That's what Nick tells Marjorie in the end of something, okay? And up in Michigan, one of his first stories, she had to have it, but it frightened her, Liz Coates. Yeah. She's being, raped by Jim Gilmore, right? It's all over the place. And so I think my students anyway are extremely perceptive, because I think they like, after they read, we always start with Indian Camp. So that's story one. And so they get this kind of crash course in close reading with Ernest Hemingway. How do we start to make sense of these stories through craft? And after they do it once, then they start to know, hey, I can do this. I can close read and figure out what these details mean, and they start piecing things together. So really it helps grow confidence. My students love it. I think they'll continue to love it too.
Okay. So Michael, I think we're gonna test how nimble our guests are, because we're getting really good comments, and there's somebody offered a one true sentence that is, I think, really worth talking about, and is probably related to what we're saying. So I will just say as background, this sentence that we're going to offer up is in my top 25 true sentences. Yeah, I do rank them, and this is top 25 at least for the week. And it is towards the end of Hills Like White Elephants, the story that Kawai mentioned. And the sentence is, they were all waiting reasonably for the train. And the one thing I will say, and I'd like to hear what you guys say about that, is that the key is that anytime in a Hemingway story he gives you an adverb, which is rare, you have to pay attention. So how does one wait reasonably for a train? Okay, I'm gonna. Who wants to kick that one off? That's
I'll save you, Kawai, if you're okay with that. I'll go first.
No, please do.
Well, reasonably, right? If you're waiting, how awkward is it to wait for a train, or to sit in an airport, waiting just interminably for the thing that it's funny. My wife and I were just talking. There's this great video of like, every single time you're in an airport, you go check to see if your gate has the plane there. Even if it's like, okay, well, in 5 hours, I'll be able to come back to my gate. And so then you leave again, right? You're always like checking for where you're going to go. So I guess to wait reasonably, one, there's a bar. They drink in Hills Like White Elephants. So reasonable drunks is a wonderful oxymoron. It's a forced reasonability. So you're not being reasonable, dear. You're being unreasonable at this point. So to wait reasonably would be to be somewhat awkward, and maybe a forced reason. Forced, I know what I'm doing. I know where I'm going. I have an idea of what I want to be. I'm being reasonable in this space, which makes no sense because they're in like the middle of the desert. Like, it's just such a strange like combination of atmosphere for them to be reasonable at any point in that story.
Michael, Kawai, either of you want to weigh in on this?
Now, I think one of the things about that story, for me, I think the thing that makes that particular story is which I think it's why it gets workshopped, or not workshopped, but it's brought up in so many like literary classes, and so many people talk about it, is this perfect example of misdirection in dialogue. So they say things, they speak past each other throughout most of the exchange that happens between this man and this woman, they speak past each other. And it's also a really good example of, and I wish I could remember who is this quote is attributed to, but one of the ways you can think about dialogue is things that people do to each other. It's like an action. You are doing something to another person in dialogue. Like I always try to think about that in dialogue when I'm writing. It's like they can't just talk the way normal people talk, where you're like, hey, yeah, how's it going? It's all right. What do you know, all of these things that mean nothing, absolutely nothing. They're just filler. And you can't do that in dialogue in a book because it just bores. Everybody's like, man, we're boring. Humans are boring. But if you use dialogue if it's a very active thing, if you think about it as like, well, are these people telling each other they love each other? Are these people in a fight? Like, what's happening here? Somebody trying to get something from somebody else. And when you do that with dialogue, then it becomes fascinating. And it can be this ping pong. And that's what's happening here. But it's like they're playing two different ping pong games, and they're hitting the ball to another person that's not even swinging for it or whatever. And so for me, that reasonably part, it really comes back to what the man is doing in that story, because he thinks he's being so reasonable, right?
Exactly.
It's like soaked in misogyny, right? He's so reasonable. It's like, just let a little air in. It's like, nothing's gonna happen. It's just so reason. It's gonna be such an easy. This is gonna take a second, right? And the whole time he's saying that, it's so clear that like he's desperate to believe that. He really wants to believe it's just gonna be. This is not a big deal. This is so reasonable. This little thing I'm forcing you to do, basically. I'm demanding that you do it, but no, I'm not demanding. Let's be reasonable about this, right? And so all that's happening on the other side, what's coming back from the woman, it's just like these people are in a place where they are not happy with each other. I would go so far as to say they hate each other in this moment, right? Yeah. But you don't get any of that. Nobody says that. They never say, I hate you or anything like that, right? They're just firing this dialogue past each other, and they're both kind of hurting each other. Like she insults his intelligence. I haven't read the story in years, so I'm trying to remember, but I'm like, she's implying all these things about him, but she never says it directly. So I'll be quiet. I don't know if that
she does say, would you please stop that, right?
How many? Seven times, yeah, right.
Yeah.
And how much of this story is actually dialogue? Like 90,
almost all
of it, right?
Yeah. So anytime at the beginning where there's like a description of the place, he's like, here's where the people are, reasonably waiting for this train, and then they just start talking. And then I think there's one, there's like the hills like white elephants, I think.
And then this moment at the end, right?
The beads. The beaded curtain and so forth, right? Yeah.
So any moment where it's not dialogue, that automatically stands out even more. And then any moment where there is an adjective or an adverb, that just adds to it. I do, as Kawai's saying, I see this as obviously the narrator speaking, but almost over the man's shoulder. We're kind of getting it from his perspective. The man's he's acting. We're following him. He's seeing people drinking, and then he's drinking. So it seems like he's thinking about how other people are being reasonable, and he too is being reasonable.
Yeah, right.
And the woman is not being reasonable, he thinks. And they obviously are talking past each other, and she can't make him shut up.
The other really good adverb in that story is she smiled brightly at the waitress. When you're in the middle of a fight at a restaurant and a waitress comes over. Well, this happens to other people, not me, of course. But when a waitress comes over and you plaster a fake smile on, and it's like, bing, that's an adverb that also calls attention to itself, right? She smiled brightly. I love that. Yeah, that's very. I sometimes, and Kawai, you'll have to speak to this, but I always feel like Hemingway has like a limited number of adverb chips, and he's like, all right, I'll play one, I maybe play two, but he doesn't have many. He doesn't allow himself many. Do you have a philosophy about adverbs, Kawai?
Just to try and cut them as much as possible, put as few of them in there as you can. I think that Marquez was also quoted as saying something to the effect that as he progressed as a writer, he got more and more to the point where he would just take out every adverb. He would see an adverb and he would just remove it. And I think that they typically are props, right? It's like you're kind of holding something up that it's always, for me, I'm like, if I want to use an adverb, then I'm like, well, I should just restructure this sentence. And I'm sure if you pick up my book and you'd be like, but there are 400 adverbs in here. But ideally in my head, before I write it down and ruin it, I think of the sentence as like, if an adverb is in there, like, can I rewrite this to be more direct and sharper without an adverb? And not most, but there are many writers who I think that's that same philosophy. An adverb shows up, and you're kind of like, if that's why, there's got to be a stronger verb somewhere, right, or something, right? Can I just use a stronger verb, or even a noun? Can I use a noun to do the work that would have been done by a verb or an adverb? So that's...
But then you read The Great Gatsby, which the same year as Indian Camp, and there are every page is, he cried incredulously is the most famous line in the whole, is attached to the most famous line. So Fitzgerald wielded them like adverbs like a ninja, but that's maybe one of the big differences. Can we move on to another one true sentence that we got from, guys? We should take this act on the road. We can do one true sentence parties all around the globe. Okay, Michael, can you see the one in the comments? Do you want to read that one out? Do you see it?
Sure. Now in his mind he saw a railway station at Karagach, and he was standing with his pack. And that was the headlight of the Simplon Orient cutting the dark now, and he was leaving Thrace then after the retreat.
Yeah. Okay.
Did I get it all? I think
yes. Yes. Now in his mind. So Snows of Kilimanjaro, Ross, does that resonate with you? What about first of all, this sentence in and of itself, but what about those flashbacks, which Hemingway never did, but in Snows of Kilimanjaro, that is the defining component to that structure.
Well, he gets to be a writer playing a writer, which, writers sometimes really love doing that, and sometimes writers really hate doing that. Like, they don't want to write a book about a writer. Like, that's the worst. But if Hemingway, I'm so glad this sentence came up, because after we had done our interview, another sentence, or at least another phrasing from Snows of Kilimanjaro, which I never gave a lot of time to. I was really an In Our Time person, which I still am. Indian Camp is proof. But Snows of Kilimanjaro has really grown on me as I've aged and as I've read it more often. Because it's about writing and it's about being a writer. And those flashbacks are perfect, because you have to think of those as not Hemingway writing Hemingway style. He's writing sort of in a more self-indulgent moment, because these are the memories of the main character as he could have written, but they're living somewhere in his past. He's never going to be able to get them out. And the perfect way to solve that is at the end of the story, you get arguably maybe Hemingway's most lyrical, beautiful sentence, where it literally rises, right? And through the fog, as high as all the world, you could see the snow-capped peaks of Kilimanjaro. And it gives you goose pimples thinking about as high as all the world. It's a perfect sentence. But it's false, because that's not what's happening. What's happening is he's sitting and dead from gangrene, and that's his last great story. Just like all of these flashbacks are all of the great stories that writer will never write, yet they're being written for us by Hemingway. It's almost as if it's an extremely metafictional experiment that really he could only have pulled off in the 1930s, when he was at his most experimental, at his most risk-taking, and arguably his most celebrity was in the 1930s. So I love that the use of those flashbacks, not as a traditional Hemingway style, because he doesn't use them, but they have to be used here to prove that this writer's life is all ideas and not action.
Yeah. Well, if I can just interject one thing, it's the Snows of Kilimanjaro shows up in our book, One True Sentence, because to me, in a surprising way, when Craig Johnson, who is the author of, among other things, the Longmire series, he quotes the epigraph to the Snows of Kilimanjaro, which talks about the leopard that was found on the summit, and nobody has explained what the leopard was doing there. And I just thought that was incredible to choose that epigraph. So that is another interesting chapter in our book. But anyway, I wanted to just tack that onto what Ross said. Sure, Michael.
I don't know if I'm going to get kicked off the show here, but Ross was bringing up kind of the self-indulgent Hemingway style that shows up later on. I don't know about you, but I find that style and the writing that sometimes seems to move away from the more terse 1920s Hemingway style that we know Hemingway for. I find that style so rich and interesting, whether it's Snows of Kilimanjaro or it's Death in the Afternoon, in the chapter where after he's written so much about bullfighting and he says how he's left out. He talks about how he's left out so much of it, or just some of the later work that often gets, and I can say this to you, Mark, because you work on a novel that no one wants to really cross the river and into the trees, that no one really wants to read, right? But some of the later Hemingway writing that often gets pushed aside, and that's, I think, one of the many great joys of doing these interviews, and then the book is seeing how what we might call the Hemingway-esque or the Hemingway style, it really changes and grows, and it's much more rich and complex than I had initially thought before really coming into this work.
I will ignore the cheap shot about across the river and into the trees and proceed. The one thing I would say, and maybe the three of you guys could consider this. So as Michael was saying, that we get enormous variety on the show and in our book. That you see that people choose a wide variety of things. One of the commonalities, if I could pick one thing that all of our guests and all of our contributors have in common, is that everybody seems eager to place the focus on the work and the writing and Hemingway's genius as a writer. And they seem pretty tired of the Hemingway persona, the sort of the outsized cartoonish, caricature. I think the Ken Burns and Lynn Novick documentary, and of course they contributed the introduction to our book. I think that documentary did a really keen job in terms of separating the writing and what we get from it from the man, and then the portrayal or the figure, the Papa figure that Hemingway tried. So does anyone have thoughts about that, about the writing versus when you hear Hemingway and, didn't he used to drink or things like that,
Right, or like him as a hunter out in the savannah, like shooting lions and posing with it, and all like the hard drinking, brawling, just all of it, like the whole hyper, what I think we would think of as like a hyper masculine, maybe alpha male term would be used for Hemingway as sort of this classical, the man of like the 30s and 40s, where people think of the stereotype of the man. Yeah, I think that it's important. I think it's important for us to hold people who are influential in society, whether we're talking about a politician, say, or an athlete or an artist. I think it's important to hold all the parts of that person together and recognize all of them, and not downplay or try to ignore the parts of that person that might be unsavory or that might not age well, that might have been okay at the time or things. And I don't want to make it sound like I'm excusing anything of any writer or athlete or politician or anything in terms of bad behavior and things they've done that are bad things. But the thing that can be really challenging is that if we swing too far in the other direction and we get to a place where we say like the person is what they have done, right? A person, the person's worst behavior defines who they are regardless. And if they've done things that we find later on disgusting or intolerable, then everything else about them should be completely devalued. I understand that sentiment, and I recognize when people do things that are incredibly harmful, it's very difficult to still hold up the other things they've done that might be worthwhile. And I think we still have to do that. I think there's still value in that. One of the things I always think of is a friend of mine who's an opera singer who's Jewish, and he sings Wagner operas. And he's like, Wagner was like an unrepentant Nazi.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, I think it's very, to me, in a weird way, I think it's very funny that this, like, my friend's this amazing Jewish opera singer and he's singing Wagner. And part of me is like, that would probably make Wagner very angry. So it's kind of satisfying now to know that he's singing this and making this thing that's beautiful. beautiful, and it's like, you made something that's beautiful, and now I, somebody who you hated, am able to make this thing beautiful, and you probably would have never wanted me to be able to do that, and I can now do that. And I think that there's other places where that's important as well. Like, we shouldn't hide from the parts of Hemingway that we might now find very problematic, right? And I, as a writer, I'm half Black, and so there's times where I see his writing and there's things in it that to me feel very racist, right? I can see things that are very racist and very misogynist, and you should talk about those things and be like, yes, there are things in here that we find very questionable and objectionable, and he was still an amazing writer. He still wrote wonderful, valuable things, and he did these other things that we should talk about at the same time. But it does, neither one of the things discounts the other thing. We have to be able to hold both those things at the same time. And I think that's the important thing, is to, as we get to a place where we're taking a deeper look at things historically and asking ourselves questions of misogyny, racism, all the other things that are important to talk about, we should talk about those things and not let those things detract from the fact that people can still have, parts of themselves that are very awful, and they can make things of beauty. And that's a very hard thing to do as a human. You're like, they made this really incredible piece of art, and they were also in many ways a person that I would have a lot of, conflict with. So it's challenging, but it's important.
Yeah. How do you negotiate that, Ross, in your classrooms?
Well, especially since I study authorship and the profession of authorship, it's the craft and the writing is ultimately what matters. And when we're studying someone like Ernest Hemingway, whose celebrity can sometimes outweigh the work, we have to be so careful as to remind students, especially who are experiencing Hemingway for the first time, that the work is what stands the test of time, that the universality or the craft or the genius of the work is what moves us. And I really agree. I think the Ken Burns documentary did a wonderful job of not shying away from those more, again, I'll use darkness, those dark elements in Hemingway's life, that it seems like there's always been this tendency, especially in our field, that, you either have to lionize Hemingway, so he's deified. We all want to be Ernest Hemingway, which is an awful thing to want to be, or we have to disparage, remove. He's toxic. He needs to be taken away from us. But Kawai is, again, spot on with the balancing act that's required for someone like Hemingway, who, just like in The Old Man and the Sea, he went out too far. The beauty of that one true sentence, he went out too far, is quite clearly Hemingway's life, art, ability, and the fact that he broke his sons' hearts. He broke his wives' hearts. He could be a terrible person, but the last time I checked, I'm not interested in whether or not he was a terrible person. I'm interested in whether or not the man's work is worth studying and bringing to students and bringing out to the public. And if we get to that point, then I think we're doing something right.
Yeah. By my
sorry, I was going to say that the one other thing that I would add is I'm working on a new novel now. One of the things I've been spending a lot of time on is trying to understand just the capacity. How do people really react in situations of like dire circumstance, like disasters and things like that? Because there are some natural disasters in this book I was writing. And the more time you spend researching, the more time you spend looking at what's been determined about human nature, the more that you find when people are in split-second decisions, they will almost always make the humane decision. So if somebody's stepping into the road and they might get hit by a car, people are going to reach for that person and try to keep them out of the road before they have a chance to think about things. And the times when that can be short-circuited are the times when we set up false dichotomies and we reinforce difference in a way that puts people in a place where they think. Once you get people in an us versus them dynamic, then you can split people, because there's parts of our brains that want to believe in a group narrative and be part of an in-group and have a certain defense against an out-group. And so one of the things we need to work really hard on just as people is not letting our judgment of people become so harsh that it puts us into two camps and it's an us versus them, or this person versus that person, right? And I think that when we see historical figures and we want to take the parts of them that are valuable, and we should pay attention to the parts of them that are invaluable, we are exercising that.
We're exercising that subtlety and the room for context to take a person as their complete person and neither to completely reject them nor to completely hold them up as a perfect person. And when we do that and we practice that in our daily lives, it helps cut against that urge to build a wedge and to build an us versus them, because it is a very intoxicating place to be. When you get a sense of righteousness of an us versus them, it's very hard to undo that. It becomes something that can short circuit that. Then you can get to a place where you're like, this person's wearing a shirt from somebody I don't support and they're going to step into the street. And if it has been reinforced enough, then they'll be much less likely to be like, oh, I should pull that person back from the street. And that's where the problem becomes, is when you build up these really harsh barriers where you're like, you got to be us versus them, right? This plays out a lot in social media and things like that. So I don't spend much time online. I blew up my Twitter account like a year ago. And part of that was because I noticed how much of the time that's spent online is this, like, it's a sense of, you have to construct an image of yourself in public where everybody's looking at you, and so you have to have the right reaction to things that put you in the public eye in a place that you can kind of virtue signal. And you're like, it's us versus them, and let me comment on this thing in a way that makes everybody know that I'm the us, and it's such a bad place to be, just in human. So.
One of the most recent interviews we did on One True Podcast, we were talking about The Old Man in the Sea, where Santiago comes to identify with the marlin that he's trying to kill. And so he says, when I hit the fish, it was as if he himself were hit. And Romero in The Sun Also Rises, he says, the bulls are my best friends. Like, you try to kill your best friends. He's like, yeah, so they don't kill me. And so, but it's that that's a profound leap, is to be able to identify with your enemy. Remember, and I promise this will be the last time I mention Across the River and Into the Trees, but Cantwell says I respected the people, even the Germans that I was trying, that I was trying to kill. Remember in The Snows of Kilimanjaro, he skis with the enemy. So that's really well said, Kawai. That's a great point. I think we only have a couple of minutes to go. So for my last sentence or two, I want to say that I learned so much about Hemingway and writing and reading, working on this book with Michael. And much of it, as is evident tonight, was because of our wonderful guests who were generous and expansive and thoughtful. So Ross, Kawai, thank you so much for tonight and for weighing in on the One True Sentence, which really does mean a lot to Michael and me. And it's entertaining and very, very insightful.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of the project. It was great. I'm sorry I cut you off, Michael. Now we're out of time, and I took away your chance to talk.
It's no worries at all.
Speaking with you, Ross, because there's still so many holes that I have in terms of my understanding of Hemingway as a person and historically. I read his short stories, but they're largely in a vacuum. I don't spend a lot of time trying to understand Hemingway as a person, or even the timelines of when different things were published. I just sort of take them.
Right. Well, it's funny you said that, Kawai, and yes, and Mark and Michael, my friends, always a pleasure to spend time with you, to talk to you, to any project you have, always to either be part of it or to support it is something I truly enjoy. But the thing with studying Hemingway, I thought about this in preparation for this evening, is that, I'm only 36, but I spend an awful lot of time thinking about one man's writing, whether I'm teaching it, writing about it, reading it, contextualizing it. I had an evaluation last year during a Hemingway night, and I was talking about The Snows of Kilimanjaro, and I was contextualizing things and going through the 1930s and the late 20s, and my evaluator talked to me afterward and said, you realize you just sat there and reeled off just like 20 years of his publishing history, and you didn't even like break a sweat. Like, it's just so, and I made me think, and just made me stop and think, like, how much Hemingway has provided me with sort of a life, which is an interesting way to look at it. I get the privilege of being a professor. I get the privilege of being a reader and a writer. professionally, which is something that just not a lot of us get to do. So thank you. I really appreciate it.
I guess I'll say my final thing, which is to echo a lot of what's already been said, which is, Hemingway is one of those unique writers who brings together a cross section of readers and audiences, whether you come at him as a scholar or a writer or someone who enjoys fishing or traveling or however you appreciate Hemingway. That's kind of how the podcast began, as we knew it had legs because of the kind of writer Hemingway was. But one of the amazing things about the book is that the sentence becomes the center around which we have so many different kinds of writers and readers and perspectives. And I was thinking about it a couple of days ago that this book was written through COVID, when a lot of people were and are kind of reorienting and regrounding and figuring out their work-life balance. And one of the things that was that I started to realize that was really interesting about the One True Sentence project is to go through Hemingway's work and to kind of plant yourself down in one sentence. That's a very meditative and grounding kind of experience that we don't really get to do all that often, because we're talking about entire stories, or we're teaching entire novels, or we're writing entire novels. And to be able to plant yourself down in one sentence, that's a moment to take a breather, and it's a grounding moment. And I've appreciated that in some ways as much as I've appreciated what I've learned about Hemingway himself.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, of course. Thank you all for giving the talk tonight. It was fascinating to hear about. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. But that is, unfortunately, all the time that we have tonight. Again, thank you all for your comments and joining us. And again, I will be posting a link to the book in the comments section right now. So the book can be found there, and more information on the book as well. And then just so everyone knows, if you know of somebody who wanted to watch the stream but couldn't quite make it, it's okay. The stream will be published almost immediately following the broadcast here. So fret not on that. So yeah, again, thank you, Michael, Mark, Kawai, and Ross for joining us tonight. And I hope everyone has a fantastic evening. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.